Hi, my name is Janet Wolf. I'm the director of the Alex Haley Farm and Nonviolent Organizing for the Children's Defense Fund. Those are big titles for a lot of work that many people are engaged in. In fact, I don't actually go anyplace by myself. Leroy Jones is here as a partner in our work because we are convinced that primary voices, folks on the edge for whom all this stuff is urgent, are the most important voices. So I'm here at Cell Blocks and Borderstops. And in the work with Children's Defense Fund, we have often connected immigration and incarceration through the basic just kind of criminalizing black and brown bodies in this country, and what that has looked like for always in this country, that we have always targeted particular groups of people for social control and for exclusion of access to resources. And Children's Defense Fund has documented that early, when we were one of the first organizations to document the push out of kids with disabilities. And in Boston, just went around knocking on doors and saying, why aren't kids in school? And found out that there were 1 million barriers for kids that had any kind of disability. And there continue to be 1 million barriers for kids who are struggling around, whether it's racism around immigration or racism around impoverished black communities. And then the whole deal of poverty. Just, it is so hard, I think, for people to imagine what poverty feels like. And I think there is a peculiar arrogance among many of the politicians right now in this last budget crisis. You know, you look at congressional people can't go without a salary, but folks on food stamps or people in Head Start can. They can afford to wait until the things get resolved. I think that this conference ties the pieces together in a way that makes visible the larger systems that prop up the brutality of exclusion. I've been a high school teacher, a Head Start teacher, a community organizer around poverty rights, a United Methodist pastor, a college professor at the graduate and undergraduate level. And really now I'm kind of doing all of those things at the same time through the Children's Defense Fund, which is 40 years old and has been on the front lines of pushing justice for kids and the poor, by settling into local communities and figuring out what the stories are, not just the data, but the stories, and then figuring out how we change not just minds and hearts, which is a good thing, but policy and politics, how we do systemic long-term change. And so part of my work is figuring out how do we get to mass incarceration, and looking in particular at the cradle to prison pipeline. So the notion that from the beginning, like if you watch The House I Live In, you look at 3 babies in the hospital. If they're African American, you say the possibility that one of these kids will end up in prison is pretty certain. 1 out of 3 going to end up in prison. So we're trying to look at the systems that fuel that from the bottom up, and race and class are clear indicators. Public education system failing, early push out of school, marking things as juvenile crimes that used to get you detention hall. I have 5 boys. I don't think any of them would make it through the current public education system under zero tolerance, because they get marked as juveniles. And once you are part of the juvenile detention system, you are 50% more likely to end up in the adult system. So kids of color in impoverished communities are like fodder for this mass incarceration system. And it's just stunning to listen to kids who have been pushed out to school, to kids who start out school, and most kids do, hungry to learn, really excited, can't wait for the first grade, kindergarten, whatever opportunities, and then little by little, they're not only discouraged, they're labeled, and they're pushed to the edge, and then they're pushed into juvenile. So I think the key is the criminalization of black and brown bodies, and seeing that tied to our history. So it's not like just all of a sudden we got up one day. It's where we come from. In this country, it's where we come from historically, but it's also where we come from religiously through Christianity. Early on, that justified the exclusion. And churches now at a disconnect from many of the communities that are struggling hardest, often then become theological justifiers. So I think that it makes sense that it's happening at Union Theological Seminary, because part of what holds this thing up is a theology that says some people are worth a lot and some people just don't matter.